For now,
Hello.
Jerome, hi, yes, we are here.
I had to switch computers entirely. So anyway,
Wow.
I'm very, very sorry that that of course this didn't happen in our tech rehearsal. It's always like that.
Now, this is how you build a bridge. This is tenacity. This is the spirit. Let's give Jerome our fires. Thank you so much for being here, man. It's lovely to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thanks for having me, Artem, and thanks everyone for joining. It's been great so far.
Yeah. So I'll just give you your slides and be off the air. So it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and sorry again for my tardiness here. I was here, but trying to figure out the tech. So my name is Jerome Deroy. I was at a previous conference that Artem organized. So if some of you have seen me and been here before, hello again. It's great to be here. And my talk is, as Artem mentioned, it's part of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's sort of where the genesis is. And how this started, but mine is a really specific kind of case study that I wanted to talk to you about. At my company, Narativ, we specialize in storytelling, like all of the speakers at this conference, obviously. But we have been approached in the last 3 years, really 3-4 years, around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how that started and where that originated, and then specifically about one company that we worked with. So we always ask a question whenever we start our work at Narativ. Anyone that we meet, new clients, etc., we will ask the question, why do you think you need a story, and why now? And so for us, that is a really important question. And I invite you all to think about that, especially with where it concerns the theme of this particular conference, building bridges. Why do you think you need a story, and why now? Because if you ask that question, it's going to kind of refresh your intention around storytelling. So even if it's an audience that you've met before, if it's a story that you've told before, and you feel like, how do I get excited about this anew? Well, every single individual is different, right? So even though you may be there for the same topic and to tell the same story, it's going to change slightly because that person is different and they bring something different. So if you ask yourself, why do I need that story for that person, for this event, for this moment right now? It's going to create a sense of urgency in you, and it's going to create kind of a new enthusiasm for your topic. So that's why we always ask that question. And in this case, we had a company that came to us right after the murder of George Floyd. Now, for those of you who don't know about this incident, or for whom there might be a point of reference, but it's a little bit in the recess of your brains at the moment, of your memories, George Floyd was a Black individual from Minneapolis. And he was stopped by police. And as he was stopped, someone who was watching on the other side of the sidewalk started to film the encounter with the police. And this video, which was almost 9 minutes long, went around the world on the news. And what it showed was a white policeman with his knee on the neck of this Black individual named George Floyd, and stayed there with his knee on him for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And 4 other policemen had formed a wall around the policeman who had his knee on George Floyd's neck, so that nobody could intervene, including the ambulance and team that had arrived. So they were just kind of standing there while he eventually killed George Floyd. And so this obviously, because the video leaked and went all over the world, this created a huge uproar in Black communities, but not just Black communities, all people of color, but also white people took to the streets to declare themselves allies of Black people. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had already started years before this, sort of took this on as well. And that really created some kind of ripple effect, because at first it was really a social justice movement. And if you remember in 2020, in the US and in much of the world, there was a lockdown because of COVID. And this happened about three or 4 months after the first lockdown. So there were many, many restrictions, and people were not encouraged to go outside, that's for sure. And many people were wearing masks, but we had thousands of people protesting in the streets in the United States against police brutality, and especially against people of color. And even through those restrictions, people still kind of went down in the streets and took those risks because it was that important to them. So it's in that context that a company came to us, one of the Fortune 500 company, so one of the biggest companies in the world, came to us and asked us, because we'd worked with them before, they asked us, how in this context might you use storytelling? Because we feel like what happens when there's an event like this in broader society, we as people who are in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the larger kind of HR and people departments, we tend to put out a statement. And the statement goes something like this: we stand in solidarity with people who have experienced this suffering, and we promise that we will take actions. And then we kind of make a list of actions, and then we tell people, come back and check in 6 months, right? But that kind of change now, and that sort of statement isn't enough anymore. That's what they told us. Because what's happening is that our Black employees, they have an interest group called the Black Leadership Forum. And through this Black Leadership Forum, they're telling us that they want to see change faster. And they want to see it happen. And they want to be heard. They feel like their voices aren't being heard. And so what we decided to do was to sort of look at, first of all, we know the context. We know where this request is coming from. So our audience is the Black Leadership Forum of this organization. And we thought about, we know that there should be a story that gives people a sense of permission to speak out, permission to speak their minds, right? Because that was one of the diagnoses that they had when they had brought out surveys into this organization. People were saying that they didn't feel a great sense of permission to actually ask questions, or maybe the changes they're asking are too much, or maybe they won't be listened to. So we knew about that. So the question that we asked was, the story is going to be important, but before we think about the story, let's think about who's actually going to tell the story. Because in the past, it would be the CEO or the spokesperson of the company who would put out a statement. And that was on behalf of leadership and the entire organization. But we at Narativ think of leadership a little bit differently. It's not about one person, because that one person who goes out on stage, usually in the US at least, and I think in much of the world, is a white, middle-aged man. And that person comes out and gives this statement about this event that you're seeing on your screen right now. What does that communicate, right? What are the kinds of assumptions that you immediately make up in your mind? What's the perception that you get? What's the feeling that you get? And see if you can actually put yourself in the shoes of a Black employee who feels like they don't have a great sense of permission to ask questions or to voice their concerns, right? What does that communicate? So we wanted to look for the storytellers, and not just one. We came up with 5 storytellers that were in this organization, in charge. They were in leadership positions, in charge of global divisions. And we had 3 women and 2 men. One of the 2 men was of Asian descent. The other one was a white, middle-aged man, like much of the leadership in this organization. And among the 3 women, we had one woman who was Irish, another woman who was white, Irish, another woman who was Hispanic, and another woman who was African American. And so we went to these 5 storytellers, or presenters, I should say, because they weren't quite storytellers yet. And we asked them to tell us, to think about experiences that they'd had in their own lives where they had felt excluded, because that's what was going on with Black people and many other people at large. But in the context of George Floyd, that's who I'm going to be talking about. And in the context of this company, that's the population we're talking about here, is that every single Black employee had a feeling of exclusion. They felt like they didn't belong, right? So what was a time in your life where you felt like you didn't belong, where somebody else made you feel like you were not part of this. And so, like you were not part of like a functioning society, like you were not one of the members of that society, you were marginalized. And little by little, these 5 leaders told us stories, and they told us about their lived experiences of feeling excluded. And I want to give you a few examples, and this is where I have to toggle through another computer, my original computer that I had sort of started this on, because I'd like to sort of quote some of the things that people actually said, these 5 leaders, when we were working with them. Our decision was that they would be telling stories at the Black Leadership Forum online, because of course, remember this was COVID, so we couldn't do anything in person yet at that time. So we had to do it all online, and people would be on Zoom, and each leader would be telling a story of feeling excluded, and then how they see inclusion in this Fortune 500 company in order to open up a dialogue with the forum, as opposed to sort of telling the story and then leaving and letting everybody else talk. They were going to stay. They were going to stay in that Zoom room and create breakout groups. And based on the stories would serve as springboards for questions that people had, for actions that they wanted to see would be taken, right? So I'm getting a message here that my connection is not great. I'm hoping that it's still working. Yes, it says now that it's stable. So I want to quote a few of these lived experiences that people started to talk about. So remember, I told you there was an Irish woman who was one of the 5 leaders that spoke at this event. And she told me about a time when she was a student in Ireland. And she grew up in a community that was 95% Catholic and 5% Protestant. And she was in the majority in that community. But then she went to university in Northern Ireland. Now, for those of you who are aware, there was a conflict between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and the rest of the UK, an armed conflict, especially all the way through the 1980s. And that's the context in which she went to university in Northern Ireland. And she told me about a time when she was called a taig. Now, a taig is a derogatory term for someone who's Catholic that Protestants would tell Catholic people. And so she heard something like, you know a dirty taig when you see them because their eyes are too close together. So she would get these taunts and people telling these things to her at her face as she was walking to university with her friends. So she talked about that. We created this as a story because that's a time when she felt excluded. And so we talked about this in as her story, and she told this story to the group. And she told about a time when a Black employee, when she was later on in life with this company, this Fortune 500 company, when someone came to her, a Black employee came to her and said that she had just had a performance review, and that in that performance review, the person said that she was excellent at her job, but it would be better for her if she could stop wearing pants with bright patterns on them. Now just take that in. You imagine you've done your job above and beyond, you've gone through all your goals, and someone tells you that everything is great except for this one thing that you should change, and it's the color of your pants. Well, needless to say, she did not change the color of her pants, but she felt like it was important to communicate that had happened to this white Irish woman, that had happened in the context of this Fortune 500 company, progressive company that claims to be listening and claims to be attentive, right? And so it was important for that leader to make that part of her story because she wanted to communicate that everyone in the Black Leadership Forum should feel a sense of permission to come to her with these kinds of concerns. That person who gave that review no longer works at that company. It didn't take long for them to leave and to say that they were no longer welcome in that company. And of course, this kind of feedback is now highly structured, and there's no room for that sort of for that sort of feedback to be acceptable. So that's just one little example. Another one I just want to tell you about is that the white middle-aged man who's one of the leaders that told stories at this event, he talked about having 2 children out of his 3 children who are autistic. And that when he learned about that, it upended his entire life. He had to change everything that he was doing, he and his wife, and of course had to adapt to this new situation. But he talked about an experience of going to a doctor and how the doctor said, well, there's something wrong with your children, and I can't do anything for you. And then they went to someone else for a second opinion, and that's when they found out that their children were autistic. But that moment when someone tells you there's something wrong with your child and we can't do anything about it, that's when he felt excluded. And so when they told these as stories, everyone in the audience started to relate to them, not just as their leaders, but as human beings who had gone through something where in their experience, they had felt excluded. The last example I want to give you is another one of these leaders, the Hispanic leader who was part of this group, told a story about how when she came to the United States as an immigrant from Cuba, she didn't speak any English. Parents didn't speak any English. And she went to a school that was bilingual. And her first day of school, she was mistakenly put into the English speaking class. And she sat there for a whole day, not understanding anything that was being said, and people laughing at her, but she didn't know why. She couldn't engage anyone. And so she talked about what was going on in her body, that she started to sweat and that she started to become red in the face. And then, of course, what happened is that the next day she came back and a teacher said, you should not be in this class. We're going to put you in the bilingual class. She had noticed what had happened and she had kind of seen the body language and she corrected that and she put her in the right class. And that was in 4th grade. And then by the time she was in 6th grade, she spoke and wrote in English, wrote in English. And it's that teacher that she took as an example of being an ally, being an advocate for somebody else. And she used this kind of analogy of saying that this company that she's one of the leaders of was like going from 4th grade to 6th grade on their journey to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And it was a great analogy because she could ask the question, what does graduation look like, right? When we come to the end of this curriculum, what does that look like together, right? How are we going to work together? So the questions that came at her afterwards were about that. They were about, what are things going to look like? What do I, as a Black employee of this company, want and need to see, right? And of course, we had lots of stories that came in response to the stories that these leaders told. And it was one of the most effective campaigns that they had because they heard things that they hadn't heard before. And actions came out that were truly built on consensus and not just from the top down. And of course, they were bought in because these leaders stayed, right? So it wasn't like they left the room and then asked, so what are the results? They actually stayed for the entire time. And so I wanted to kind of summarize a little bit this process, because I think when we talk about building bridges and the theme of this conference, there's always a catalyst. There's something that, whether that's a conflict, whether that's the murder of George Floyd in this case, whatever it might be, perhaps COVID even was some kind of catalyst for change, right? Something happens, an event that happens, and it has a ripple effect. And it eventually goes all the way to employees of an organization, right? So that's the first kind of diagram, the first part of the diagram that you're seeing on your screen. The second is that then leadership decides to change the status quo. That has to happen. Somebody has to say, we've got to make some changes. And once somebody said that, they came to us to see how they could implement those changes. And then in our case, 5 storytellers, not just one leader, but 5 leaders told stories of exclusion and then going back to belonging and inclusion. How can we create an atmosphere of inclusion in our company based on these stories that you heard and based on the dialogue that got created because of those stories? The dialogue between Black employees and leaders, that's what really allowed for this last step to happen, an action plan that was discussed and agreed on. So I like to think of this as something that can be applied to almost anything, right? This was one case. And of course, since then, we've worked with a lot of other diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within organizations, but there's also other organizations, other initiatives that this could potentially apply to for you. So I wanted to also break that down, right? And where I wanted to start was with this term "be visible" that you see in the quadrant that's slightly to the right here. And what does that mean? That means that you have to come out and say what's wrong with the status quo, right? We actually want to change something. And here I am, one of the leaders of this organization, saying that we are going to make a change. That's what being visible means, right? It's not sort of behind closed doors with your number 2, number 3, et cetera, and you're all kind of coming together with your board or whatever it might be and saying, we're going to make a change, we need to make a change. Let's do that together, right? It's actually really saying forward facing and saying that to the world. And then you kind of take a step back once you've done that, because now that you've indicated to everyone that you do want to make a change and that you're committed to that change, you have to be able to say that you don't know what that change looks like without first listening to the people that this problem affects. And so what does that mean, listening in this case? I added 3 bullet points next to this, which is identifying and releasing obstacles first, right? You have to do the work. Now, I'm talking about a large organization. This works between people, by the way, right? So be visible. I'm noticing something that's going on and I want to change it. And now I'm going to listen to the person that's affected by that change, right? And so that could be just one person or 2 people. It could be a family. But the first thing you're going to have to do is to notice what's getting in the way of your ability to listen. What are your assumptions? What are your preconceptions? What are the things that you are not necessarily aware of? And you want to start to become aware of that as you listen. And you're going to notice those obstacles, right? Second bullet point is that you want to listen to understand and to learn. So once you've kind of cleared the slate here, you can say, to yourself, that's my intention. My intention is to understand and learn. That's what I want to be doing. And then, of course, connecting values to the DEI efforts, right? So what do I mean by connecting values? What I mean here is that, we want to be able to communicate to our audience that what we're coming up with is not done in a vacuum. It's connecting to the values that we hold dear. So that whatever it is that you're trying to change, try to connect that to the values that you already have, right? And see if then you can identify, this is the next step afterwards, identify storytellers that are going to bring those values to life. And that's where you can help to craft the stories, right? And then finally, the sharing of the stories is really important. How are you going to share those stories? Where are you going to share them? And we're saying to share them widely and strategically, right? So this is the sort of cycle that I think really can be applied, that we learned from this experience, and that we've since then started to apply really to many, many different situations, not just DEI. But of course, that's one of the big issues here in the United States and has been a big issue. And now, 3 years later, we're starting to see that the momentum isn't quite as strong, or that the movement itself is sort of changing. And so we have to adapt to that. And we have to kind of keep strong with our advocacy around DEI and making sure that the changes that people asked for 3 years ago are actually happening, right? So every time we kind of go back into this cycle. Okay, do we need to be visible about this again? Who do we need to listen to? How does this connect to our values? Who are the best people to speak about this? Where should they speak? When should they speak, right? How do we prepare them for that? So that's where, you can constantly come back to this cycle. So I want to stop here and put this slide up in terms of connecting and with me at any time. Always happy to take questions, but I wanted to have enough time for us to also have a dialogue here and hear potentially some questions that people might have. So Artem, I'll hand it back over to you.
Jerome, thank you so much. The fire is already burning for you. It's so practical, and and at the same time very human. That's what I feel every time you speak at this event. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Guys, if you'd like to ask Jerome questions, now would be the great time to do so. And while you do, I have this quick question. So this case is about a moment that was connected to one particular racial group. And what I see sometimes is that when a story of one racial group is amplified and is focused on, there are lots of groups that say, well, where have you been? Like, what's the deal? Like, shouldn't this is the great phrase. Great. Shouldn't all lives matter?
Right.
For those who don't understand. So, is there a way to story around it?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all to be aware that there is such a narrative, because we're actually talking about different narratives, right? And there's a multiplicity of stories that can be told about anything, and we ourselves as humans hold multitudes of stories about ourselves. So it's not that if I'm the most of the time I'm sort of a quiet, calm person, it doesn't mean that I never get angry and that I never get loud, right? I'm not just one type. And so, of course, there's going to be lots of different narratives around a particular event. And you're right. I mean, around that event, there was also the all lives matter and, people saying those kinds of things as well. And people sort of, protesting the protesting, et cetera. And I think what's really important in this, and where I believe that storytelling can literally build bridges, I'm not just saying that because it's the name of the conference, but it can literally build bridges between even two groups that don't agree at all, is when you start to tell a story about a lived experience, something that actually happened, that is based on a value that everyone can understand. If we all have this intention of empathy or understanding or learning, right? Learning is maybe less controversial, perhaps. If we all have that value of we want to learn something, then I'm going to look for a story where that actually happened, where I can bring that to life, right? And I think the more that we can sort of have these communications between people and not create these walls, so that, and I'll give you an example. Even in this instance, you're right, it started with the Black Leadership Forum and Black employees in particular. But then that got opened up to the entirety of the organization, so that everyone would have a sense of belonging. And that's a word that's being used more and more in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're adding a B for belonging because there's a sense that it does make some people may feel like, because we're focusing on that one group, it's now we've kind of been forgotten. But so how do we then bring those people back in? And for us, it's about, choosing your audience, making sure that even if this is about the Black Leadership Forum, that everyone gets to hear those stories and everyone gets the benefit of those experiences. So that's sort of, I think for me, it's all about the more widely you can disseminate stories about one group, the more people will actually recognize themselves in those stories, even if they don't look like them and don't have the same background.
That's a great answer. I agree with Vinod. This is really wonderful. And he's actually here with a question for you. So what factors were considered when choosing the storytellers in that company?
Yes, that's a great question. It took a little doing. It took a while to figure out who those should be. It was essentially leadership positions. That was number one. We wanted to be able to show that leaders weren't just speaking through a spokesperson, that and there wasn't just one spokesperson. So we wanted a variety of people in leadership positions. That was the first thing. Second thing is that their positions would be global, that it wouldn't just be limited to the United States. And that's how we found someone in Ireland, for example. And then the third thing was to look at, availability and also motivation, right? We wanted to have leaders who had experience in this field, not in terms, because they didn't know that we were going to ask them to tell stories about exclusion, inclusion, etc., but who had specific examples that they could point to in their career, where in the context of work, they had seen change, right? Because we didn't want to put them entirely on the spot and coming really fresh without any ideas, right? We did want them to have ideas in their stories. So those were the factors that made us consider, who we should choose. But it wasn't the concept of diversity, even in that leadership, it wasn't necessarily the priority that everybody would sort of represent different races, ethnicity, backgrounds, etc., religion. It just so happened that was kind of the makeup of the people that were there. But it was also important to show that we could have the typical white male leader telling a story of exclusion to a Black audience, right? We didn't want to just have Black people telling stories to Black people.
What I like about your answer is that authenticity stands above diversity, and therefore it just makes diversity float up to the surface. Yeah. So it's like it's not diversity for the sake of diversity, it's being yourself, and hence that's a great way to put it. Absolutely. Yes, authenticity was probably the word that was used most in those kind of coaching sessions that we had with those leaders. Yeah. And look how many insights the people are sharing in the chat. So it's lovely. And
oh, great. Yes. Yeah. I just to reflect on something that Francoise said, that in terms of listening is crucial. It's the foundation to building the bridge, yet it can be forgotten when you have leaders who think they know. Yes. And I, that's one of the things, and I think you shared some articles if people want to go deeper into this. But one of the articles talks exactly about that there was a willingness on the part of all the people who spoke and who were agreed to be at this event, their willingness to be vulnerable and to be open and to learning. So they weren't the kinds of leaders that said, I know everything. And I mean, some of the leaders, had really provocative questions, so provocative, in fact, that, HR had to sort of say, I'm sorry, but I know that you want to do a great job and you want to bring up one of these topics, but we can't because it hasn't been, it's not yet. So they were really pushing the envelope. And I think when you have that kind of leadership, then, change can really happen. But there has to be that willingness, otherwise it just doesn't work. Yeah. So that's a great reflection, Françoise. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. And also just seeing natural diversity as a perfect version of this idea growing up in our society. Yeah. And ability to strongly empathize would be a key factor too. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Empathy, you would think that everyone would have that, but what we've learned at Narativ is that empathy is actually a skill. You really have to learn empathy. It's not something that's ingrained into everyone. And in fact, the other way, sort of what we call othering, right? You only see the world as me versus them or us versus them. That is also learned, right? So we can actually efficiently and effectively counter these kinds of mindsets, and in order to try to change them and to go more towards an empathy mindset. But it's not a given. So yeah, once you find those people who have that and who've learned that, and you start to hear their stories, I think that's when change really starts to happen.
Since the fires are burning bright, I think that landed well. And that gives hope, like that you can learn empathy. Empathy can be learned. That meaning gives hope. And that brings us to the last question, actually. So once again, you came to this conference, which thank you so much for doing this again. And in these circumstances, especially, you've proved that people can build bridges across borders. That's a huge meaning. And I want to ask, what one more meaning, like a statement, would you like to get people inspired about so we can live in a world with more bridges in it?
Hmm. I think, one of the things that I've been hearing other speakers talk about, and the kinds of Esther Choi was talking about the kinds of questions you ask, and those sorts of things. And in this experience that I just relayed to you, and when you look at the state of the world and all these different kinds of conflicts that exist, you can feel a sense of despair, perhaps. That things are not changing the way that they should be changing, and you could really, just lie on the floor in a fetal position and stay there, and you would be justified. I would completely understand. And yet there's something about the human spirit that makes us stand up. And I think, there's this phrase, stand up for yourself. I think for me, as we talk about building bridges, what if you said stand up for others, where you see something where your privilege, you recognize your privilege, and you recognize that you've had chances just because of the way you look, because of where you went to school, and because of how you grew up. That's it. That's privilege. That's the definition of privilege, right? And recognize that others don't have those same opportunities. How can you be a stand for other people to have those kinds of opportunities? What can you do in your life to stand for others? I think that's really what those leaders in that company committed to doing, because they recognize their privilege, first of all, and they recognize that others didn't have it. And so I think if we can all do that in a little way, could be just, the person you come by, you walk by every day in the street that's begging for money, maybe learn something about them, or whatever it might be. Someone in your kids' schools, whatever it is, but try to find someone that you can stand up for and see how that might change things. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I got so impressed that I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much. Finding somebody who you could stand for and standing for them. Lovely. Jerome, it's been such an honor and a pleasure, and all those fires that are burning in the right corner are for you. I hope you guys enjoyed this talk with really so many practical advice. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks everyone for listening and for watching, and sorry again about the technical difficulties at the beginning.
That's fine. You've done it, so that's fine.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. This has been such a pleasure, guys. I hope you enjoyed